by slicing open the car's convertible top and dropping a Molotov cocktail inside the interior. Police and fire department.
But it is, guys. It's your boy Tyrone Couple, and we are here with this late-breaking information that apparently P. Diddy, the diddler, getting caught blowing up Kid Cudi. More to 11.
Did Sean Combs really try to blow up rapper Kid Cudi's car?
Yes.
It's a stunning allegation that we first saw in Cassandra Ventura's lawsuit, but is now echoed by prosecutors in their criminal case against the entertainment mogul. We're going to break this down for you, and we get a chance to speak to a fire investigator about what evidence can prove Combs was allegedly behind this arson. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. There is quite an incredible allegation surrounding Sean Diddy Combs that we have to talk about. And the question becomes, how will prosecutors prove this? So as we know, Combs was arrested last week pursuant to a grand jury indictment out of the Southern District of New York. He's charged with racketeering conspiracy. Basically, there was an agreement between him and others to operate a criminal enterprise that engaged in a pattern of illegal activity, and that for years,
AKA, he had to pay for everything and still went to prison.
Combs threatened and abused women, sex trafficking
had
of an individual by using force, fraud, or
one of his
coercion to
guards,
have them perform commercial sex acts, and transporting people to engage in prostitution. Very serious felony charges. If convicted,
he should not have
potentially he
paid
could be
the
looking
women
at the rest of his life behind bars. Now, in the indictment, prosecutors allege that as part of this racketeering conspiracy that Combs and his
you'll just go to jail for it. Don't even pay.
They participated in a number of underlying or predicate crimes that prosecutors are going to prove. Forced labor, sex trafficking, kidnapping, violent acts to assert control to further the criminal enterprise. In fact, the indictment reads, when employees, witnesses to his abuse, or others threaten Combs' authority or reputation, Combs and members and associates of the enterprise engaged in acts of violence, threats of violence, threats of financial and reputational harm, and verbal abuse. These acts of violence included kidnapping and arson. And that is what I want to focus on right now, the arson idea. So, in a racketeering charge, prosecutors have to prove, as I mentioned, these underlying crimes, at least two predicate underlying crimes. And here, arson is defined under the California Penal Code as a person is guilty of arson when he or she willfully and maliciously sets fire to or burns or causes to be burned, or who aids, counsels, or procures the burning of any structure, forest land, or property. Now, who could this be in reference to, right? Which arson is this about? Well, going back to Cassandra Ventura's lawsuit, and remember, Combs' ex-girlfriend, who initially sued him for sexual assault, battery, sex trafficking back in November 2023, started this whole ball rolling. She alleged in her lawsuit, quote, in 2011, during a rough patch in a relationship with Sean Combs, she ended up having a relationship with rapper and Grammy Award-winning artist Kid Cudi, real name Scott Cudi. And then she alleged, quote, Mr. Combs found Miss Ventura's phone and found emails between her and Kid Cudi. Mr. Combs became enraged and proceeded to place a manual corkscrew between his fingers and lunged at Miss Ventura. Miss Ventura ran away to stay at Kid Cudi's home to escape Mr. Combs' wrath. Soon thereafter, one of Mr. Combs' staff members told Miss Ventura that he needed to just talk to, even though Mr. Combs was enraged. Feeling like she could not escape Mr. Combs and his network of enforcers, Miss Ventura returned to Mr. Combs. He hit her several times and then kicked her in the back as she tried to run out of the door. The following year, she claimed, quote, Mr. Combs told Miss Ventura that he was going to blow up Kid Cudi's car and that he wanted to ensure that Kid Cudi was home with his friends when it happened. Around that time, Kid Cudi's car exploded in his driveway. So now we have that allegation. And we have the mention of arson in the indictment. But then we go to the government's bail letter that they filed with the court. They were advocating that Combs be denied bail. He has been twice. And they allege, quote, in the early morning hours of December 22nd, 2011, the defendant and a co-conspirator kidnapped an individual at gunpoint to facilitate breaking into and entering the residence of Individual 1. By the way, Individual 1 is not named, but we'll get to that. Multiple witnesses would testify at trial to the events surrounding the kidnapping and break-in, the latter of which is corroborated by police reports and other records. Approximately 2 weeks later, the defendant's co-conspirators set fire to individual one's vehicle by slicing open the car's convertible top and dropping a Molotov cocktail inside the interior. Police and fire department reports extensively document the arson and conclude that the fire was intentionally set.
Oh boy.
Multiple witnesses would also testify to the defendant bragging about his role in destroying individual one's car. Hence why we can make the argument that they are referencing Kid Cudi. This echoes Ventura and the indictment. Actually, I should say that while this mirrors Ventura's description of events, she said this happened slightly later than when prosecutors say it happened, about a month or so difference. But putting that to the side, Kid Cudi actually responded to Ventura's claims in the lawsuit. His representatives told the New York Times back in November when this suit was filed, "This is all true." It's so good to see you. Thanks for coming on. First, let's start. How do fire investigations work? Before we even get into the specifics of this, how do fire investigations work?
Well, it's kind of a science. Well, it actually is a science. You have to take each step of the investigation in line with the NFPA guidelines for fire investigations, which is to identify a problem, collect evidence, take that evidence and create a hypothesis, and then you have to prove that hypothesis. So it's called the scientific methodology of conducting a fire investigation. So that is kind of the groundwork for fire investigators. So we have now a guideline to begin our investigation. At that point, you look at the fire, you look at burn patterns, you collect evidence, maybe even evaluate whether or not an accelerant such as gasoline or acetone or something is used to accelerate the fire. And then you might look for devices. You might look for Molotov cocktails, as you mentioned earlier. But that process is the investigative scene examination process. And then you have to take that information you gathered and you develop your hypothesis on how that incident may have occurred. So outside of that, then you start collecting information from interviews, from video footage that might be at or near the fire incident. And then you might collect things like fingerprints or something that would leave, maybe DNA or something like that, something that would connect the crime to a person.
So when I mention in this case that the government has these fire records and they feel pretty confident to show what they pertain it to show, what would these fire records show to a jury if they're presented in a court of law?
Well, just as I had mentioned, the records would identify the process of which they conducted their investigation. In a courtroom, attorneys understand the guidelines for fire investigations. So if their case is weak or if they're feeling a little bit threatened by the progress of prosecution, then they start picking apart the actual investigative process. And they will take it line by line, item by item. They'll challenge every aspect of the investigation. And then they may even start picking apart the qualifications of the fire investigator. So that is why it's so important to try, as an investigator, to try your best to follow the provisions outlined, the standard of care, I call it, of NFPA 921, which is the guide to fire and explosion investigations. And then also make sure that your credentials are solid. You have to have continued training and certification. So that's kind of what you would expect to see in those reports.
Do you have any concern that this is from 2012, right? That's a long time ago. Would that change anything about these records? Would it change? I mean, obviously, if you're talking about a fire investigator coming on the stand, like any witness, you're dealing with something that's from so long ago. There could be witness memory issues. But in terms of the fire records from so long ago, anything we should be thinking about there?
Well, as long as the fire investigator conducted his investigation in accordance with the guidelines, provided that that investigator, whoever that may be, is qualified to conduct that investigation, a record is a stamp in time, if you will. The facts don't change unless the investigator, and I do this with my reports, is I leave it open-ended. So if additional information should come forth that may change the outcome or change the direction of the investigation, the investigator has the ability to add a provision or a clause within that report to say, upon further investigation or additional information, I have the right to change my opinions or enhance my opinions. Right. So I think the report, as it sits, is fine unless an investigator has additional information they may have collected.
So when I'm laid out the facts as alleged by the prosecution and as alleged by Cassandra Ventura, and you're talking about allegedly a Molotov cocktail being used to blow up this car, what do you expect prosecutors will do to show that this happened? Can they prove that it was intentional? How can they prove that a Molotov cocktail was used?
Well, the evidence of the Molotov cocktail being in the vehicle and the slash of the roof is evidence that a suspicious fire or an intentional fire has occurred. So that information is pretty solid. And then you have to start looking for intent. Why was this even done? Was it an act of revenge? Was it an insurance fraud situation?
Act of revenge.
That you have to kind of figure out what was going on. So when you do your interviews, you have to ask the questions, when were the last payments made on your vehicle? Are you upside down in the car? You have to kind of weed out all of the things that may be on the sidelines. And then you just kind of focus your attention on, okay, have you had any recent threats? Have you had any phone calls that may have been made that threaten you or your friends or your family? And then you start honing in on motive. And, arson, there are several different types of motives: arson for profit, revenge, crime cover-up, that type of thing. So as an investigator, you have to begin to weed through all of those potential motives and have to hyper-focus your investigation on who did this? Who are the suspects? Who are the players in this potential arson crime?
Yeah,
and once you do that, you start asking the questions. It's no different than a detective seeking out information with regard to a homicide or something like that. So you have to be able to ask the appropriate questions. It sounds like with the reports that I'm reading is that the investigators have gone down that path, and they have a lot of confidence that they have their person.
Just to follow up on this, though, how confident can you be that it was a Molotov cocktail? Why do I say that? I imagine defense attorneys will say, you're saying it's a Molotov cocktail. We can prove it's something else. Maybe we can prove it was not intentional. And if we can even if we can't prove it was not intentional, if we can say it was caused by something other than a Molotov cocktail, it's kind of a chip at the prosecution's case, right? If you can provide an alternative explanation. So how can they be confident that they could say, again, that it was intentional, it was a Molotov cocktail? Is that, if they're painting themselves in that way, right, and that's what seems to be, is that they have to feel confident that that was what it was. The fire investigator has to feel confident that that was what it was. What are some telltale signs that, again, it was intentional and a Molotov cocktail?
Good thing they got witnesses.
Well, the first thing you do, whether you have a container to carry, a Molotov cocktail basically is a container with some form of a fabric, or we call it a fuse, that the container is holding whether a gasoline or some form of flammable liquid. So we know that we have the flammable liquid, and a flammable liquid is really not supposed to be inside of a vehicle. So you have that element that there is something foreign that has been introduced to the interior of the vehicle, and that can be determined by the use of an arson dog or a canine. They go in and they identify areas that an accelerant may have been used. And at that point, you collect lab samples, you collect seat cushions, carpeting, whatever, and then you send that off to a lab for further examination, and they make a determination what type of accelerant it is. So that kind of, you set that aside, going, well, we have an accelerant inside of a car, and then you start looking for fragments of a bottle. And if you can even piece together some form of a container that's been thrown in the vehicle, that helps. But ultimately, the gasoline inside the vehicle is not a normal thing. So you've got the element of an arson just in the fact you have gasoline in the car. So, right. I think that may be where they're going with this. Even if somebody says, well, it wasn't a Molotov cocktail, which is another charge, actually, because it's a device that's been constructed for the purpose of setting a fire. So there's a separate charge with that.
Those would be state charges, right? I mean, this is more of part of an overall federal racketeering case. I do want to ask you this. You mentioned DNA. That perked my ears up. Is it possible that, given the description I laid out, that DNA could be present in that car? To the extent, obviously, Kid Cudi's DNA would be in the car, right? It's his car. But the idea of knowing who allegedly was operating this Molotov cocktail, what are the chances you get DNA from that?
Well, the chances, you know, in reality, the chances are fairly slim. But in certain cases, DNA has proven to be very helpful, such as a discarded cigarette, or maybe some gloves that have been left behind at the scene, or maybe the container that was used to carry the gasoline to the scene was not handled with gloves. It might have just been somebody's raw fingers that are on this thing, and which is transferring DNA. So there's different transporting of DNA to a scene. So if you can get that from something, whether it be a door handle or whatever it might be, that's something that investigators would consider. Whether it's successful or not, it just depends on how cunning the arsonist is and how protective they are of the DNA, what's left behind. So that's kind of where I would see it to be helpful.
With that being said, it's your boy Tyrone Copper, aka BlastphamousHD, aka hot chocolate on the weekends when I be stripping for money. Twist.